Okay, for the last time in May, I am going to talk a little bit about 1968 and go from there. Had a couple issues with the streaming. For some reason, YouTube wasn't picking up and I had to reboot. We're kind of slaves to Google, I guess. But boy, it got really dark out. And a little bit 1968. I'm going to give the quiz right after it. It's going to be like 18 questions and a short ID. And the quiz I'm going to drop right after this, right after I'm done with this to see how far I get. And it's going to be due over the next few days. So try to get it done by as soon as you can, obviously, but Monday or Tuesday would be great. And just one sec. Should be a really basic quiz, and that's going to be your second to last assignment. The last assignment will be the notes, and it'll be the notes all the. I'm still trying to decide. The notes will be either this week and the few days I'm going to do next week, or I'm going to divide it up in two. It kind of depends. That makes it a really big file, so I think I might do something else. But I am going to broadcast and put this out. And the same deal, I am going to grade this. I'm going to give these a little bit more points than I have in the past, just because we're nearing the end. And a couple things. Next week, I know they're going to start doing textbook hand-ins. I don't know the exact times, but it's going to be on Wednesday and Thursday. Make sure you get your textbooks in. Yes, I have to give a summer assignment for next year's AP US History. And so I'd like him to be able to collect the books, but I'm also going to send those out with, or send them all the PDF with the files. But please get it in. It's like a $170 fine for your America book. It's like $35 for Zen, and the review books are shockingly expensive because we basically have to double the fines because we have to buy a whole new set if we lose too many. So it's kind of one of those things. So please get that stuff in. All right. I went through yesterday and went through as many grades as I can. It's really hard to go back and look at makeup work because there's no easy way to do it. You have to push a bunch. You have to go to a bunch of different screens and go from there. So if you turn in something late, and I might miss it, especially now. I went through all of them and tried to get as many makeup assignments as I could. But I'm not going to do that again unless someone tells me to do it. So if I miss something you turn in, please let me know. Especially for a couple of things. I said I'd give you a few more points, extra credit on your DBQ, the last DBQ. If you redid it, kind of address some of the mistakes. If you did that, I'd give you the points. You have to let me know. Because I'm going to miss it. I don't know when people hand something in. You hand something in late. I have no idea. And so don't expect me to find it because I'm telling you right now, I probably won't from now on. I went through every single class, every assignment. And so that's not going to happen again. And so let's go ahead and get started. Went through a lot yesterday. And it's pretty amazing when we talked about the long, hot summers and what happened here, and we're seem to be seeing it again for many of the same reasons. And a lot of times it's the same reaction and backlash against it. I told you about how the big issue was that yes, they could get rid of the laws, and it was incredibly hard to get rid of Jim Crow laws. And then the next year to get some kind of Voting Rights Act, which by the way has been basically thrown out. But it's incredibly hard to redress those issues that were inherent with racism, the economic justice, and the fact that a permanent underclass has been created. And this really does relate to economies of scale, that iron rule of economics. Those with more power, the big, have a huge competitive advantage, and it grows and grows and grows. And it still exists today. It still exists today. I got to be very clear about that. The economic difference between those who have been on the bottom because of racism and those who have been on top. And when I told you about in Newark how snipers were out there shooting, they say any adults, males, but this is a shot from Life magazine of a 12-year-old boy, any black male. And we just had right now. It's amazing how this reaction happens and this conservative backlash from the black power and black consciousness. And we have the president right now of the United States saying that we should shoot looters and protesters. And that's turned into some big kerfuffle over Twitter, but it's amazing how that backlash happens. So the conservative backlash against this would be huge. And it was one of those I've mentioned before. One of the reasons why so many leaders of the civil rights movement wanted civil disobedience and make it nonviolent. Because then conservatives who opposed equal rights can say, look what happens when you give them rights. And it goes back to that positive good theory of slavery, that slaves slaves need to be enslaved. If not, they'll be savages and commit crime. And then so much of the Great Society aid, even though it was incredibly popular at the time, there's this undercurrent of all the aid's going to them. I'm getting nothing from this, but it's going to them. And who was them? Well, people who weren't white. Got to be very clear about that. And you saw a lot of this. And then this traditional values. These hippies and drug addicts and people out there committing crimes. Let's get back to real values. And then this concept more and more of states' rights, which became the Republican strategy of the Southern strategy. And states' rights was anti-civil rights, but it fits in with people knowing their place. Let's go back to when people know their place. It's no coincidence that you have this conservative backlash in the late 1960s, and the biggest cultural trend of the 1970s were like 1950s television shows and movies. Movies like American Graffiti and television shows like Happy Days. Look how when people knew their place in the 50s, well, that's when there was Jim Crow laws and there wasn't and the cult of domesticity. And so here is anti-school integration called busing right here, and whites have rights too, which is a fascinating thing. And then this one is just terrifying. Race mixing is communism. And that's what King would be called, and all of them would be called, thus playing the Cold War fears, and bring that in there. And this guy, yeah, that anger is palpable. Today, the only difference would be that everybody would have an assault rifle. And so with that, well, these type of people. And while this is happening, you have an absolute revolution in music. It's pretty amazing how this awkward segue would lead to this change in music, which would come about when you have the beginnings of rock and roll, but then the commercialization and the attempt to market it to a mass audience, aka white people, would lead to, I'm not saying there wouldn't be good music, but in 1964, you would have what's called the British invasion. And the big thing about the British invasion is they took mostly American music, which is this hodgepodge of different cultural and ethnic groups, made this music, which is so American, part of the reason why I like it so much. And it went to Britain, and then they synthesized it there and brought it back and reinvigorated the music scene. But credit this concept of the band. The band. Before, it was always a push to get this one musician who they could market as the individual to sell. And the band. And so while you have this great cultural change going on, you have the development of very sophisticated, more politically adept music, sophisticated songs that were, and this concept too of more and more of these bands were creating their own music and writing their own songs. Oh yeah, they were still being cheated out of money and music contracts. Nobody more than the biggest band of them all, the Beatles. And the Beatles came from working class poor backgrounds in Liverpool, England, and just by a combination of hard work and being incredibly talented with all sorts of different things happening all at once, the Beatles hit in 1964 and changed music forever. And they appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show. Now, I showed you the Ed Sullivan Show a little bit earlier, and I showed you Elvis on it, I believe. And that was a big deal when Ed Sullivan, who didn't like rock and roll music, but had Elvis on rather reluctantly. And, well, By then, they had totally capitulated. And when the Beatles came, and they were just hitting, they'd already been popular in Britain, this would become the most watched television show in history. Now, the most watched event would be the man landing on the moon. Okay, so back to music. So you have this big, or the back, we have to leave music for a little bit. I could do on the Beatles forever. This is one of the things that normally in special topics, I would do a thing on the Beatles. And we still did the history of rock and roll special topics, but things changed with this, so I didn't do as much on the Beatles. But also, in 1967 was one of the most famous events in the history of Sweden. Högertrafikomläggningen. I can't speak Swedish. But what they decided is a great cultural experiment without telling anybody is they switched all the traffic laws in Sweden in one day. They went from they did cars went on the right. So you always went on the right when you went on the street. They switched it so you had to go on the left. Green became stop. Red became go. They changed all the traffic signs. I mean, they changed everything and created the biggest traffic jam in the history of Sweden. Yes, you can't make this up. Högertrafikomläggningen. Okay, so that kind of personified going into 1968, the events of that year. Going into 1968, LBJ had been saying for the whole year that we're winning the Vietnam War. There's light at the end of the tunnel. And even though the anti-war protest was growing bigger and bigger, there's still the majority of the population thought the United States must win the war and thought the U.S. should do more to win. Now, there are a lot of people who simply thought, well, we started it, we have to finish it, or communism was such a threat. So it's still the majority, even though it's shrinking. The thing was, by the end of 67, the casualties were horrific. And these are civilians killed in an operation in 1967 called, it's in the Iron, place called the Iron Triangle near Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. And by the end of 67, LBJ was told that we're winning the war, but remember I told you about search and destroy missions. Search and destroy missions were going out, and the whole idea was to kill so many of the enemy they have to quit. And they were telling them, well, we're killing all the enemy and they have to be near the end. Well, it became pretty clear that they were exaggerating the body count. And what I mean by that is that they would go through and count the number of South Vietnamese soldiers they killed. So they would literally go through in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They would count. Well, the problem with this, I think you could probably guess, is how do you do this? What is a dead Viet Cong? So they would just simply say, okay, any body is dead. What if the body's burned and mutilated by napalm and high explosives? Nah, that's dead. What if they see a spot of blood? Nah, that's one. What if they see 2 drag marks where it looks like somebody drug a body and see the 2 feet? Well, that's surely he's dead too. There's one. And what if you want promotion? Are you going to say, you know, we only saw one person? Or are you going to say, we saw a blown up, or that piece of jungle was totally destroyed by napalm, and so we killed 8. And then it would get back to Saigon and it would become 80. There's a famous story, one of LBJ's aides, George Reedy, who was in the Rage Within. Within the McCarthy video I showed you. He was listening to these counts by the end of 67, realized that the Army was claiming that we had killed more Vietnamese, or Viet Cong, than there were Vietnamese, and more than the entire Army. And he passed a note to LBJ, and LBJ was furious. He said, I don't want to hear that now, we're winning. Because we had to be winning. And Reedy would soon resign. And so the thing was this. They're winning, but it was taking much longer. And were they really winning? Every time the U.S. sent more troops, North Vietnam sent more troops. They're still fighting. And so Johnson went on this big public relations campaign, went all around the country, even went to South Vietnam for a quick trip, and said, we're winning, we're winning, we're winning, we're winning. And always would say there's light at the end of the tunnel. And he trying to convince people we're near victory. So going into 68, which was an election year, he had to convince people the sacrifice is worth it. It's nearly done, even though over 20,000 Americans have died in Vietnam. By the way, to give you an idea, that should give you an idea of the carnage we have right now, where over 100,000 Americans have died due to coronavirus. But in 1968, the illusion would be shattered with what's called the Tet Offensive. Tet was a name for the Vietnamese New Year, which is the Lunar New Year. So since the lunar calendar is a little bit off, it happens at different days every year. And this is going to be at the end of January 1968. And what happened was American forces, the actual U.S. ground combat troops, have been occupied with a series of battles along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So they're drawn to the borders. That's where the main fighting was. And this hit Viet Cong, a massive Viet Cong operations, and some North Vietnamese soldiers begin to infiltrate cities to begin a massive offensive, a surprise attack on January 31st. There had been an informal Tet Offensive, or I'm sorry, a Tet Truce, and so they figured that was a perfect time to do this. A massive offensive all over South Vietnam, all over. And the thought was this would trigger uprisings. They thought that uprisings would, the people would finally rise up and overthrow the corrupt dictatorship in South Vietnam. So that was a puppet government of the United States. It's more complex than that, but that's what the North thought. Ho Chi Minh actually had very little to do with this. By 1968, he was old and pretty infirmed. And so this was done by a cadre of generals and leaders who were becoming more and more totalitarian. But anyways, they thought this triggered this uprising, and they attacked virtually every base across South Vietnam. And the thing was, even though they attacked virtually every major city, including Saigon, the capital, it failed. But, and this was not planned. They thought it would work. Oh, I almost forgot something. This should remind you of something. This is almost exactly what the United States thought would happen at the Bay of Pigs. They just assumed it would happen and were completely and totally wrong. And so with that, it failed. South Vietnamese soldiers actually fought the best they ever had. They beat back the offensive. There was no uprising. But this totally and completely changed the attitude in the United States. Scenes like this from the capital of South Vietnam, which the U.S. said not only is protected, but we're winning the war. Remember, there's light at the end of the tunnel. Does not look like victory. Here are South Vietnamese soldiers with American equipment. Well, that's actually a South Vietnamese soldier. These are American armored personnel carriers going through the streets of Saigon to defeat South Vietnamese soldiers. The Life magazine shot at the right here. This is a Viet Cong sapper, which is another term for an engineer. They have blown their way into the U.S. embassy, which was like this fortified citadel within the middle of Saigon, to do an attack on the embassy. And they actually took a number of floors of the embassy and held off for days until Marine guards, Army MPs, and CIA operatives finally defeated them. When you have to root out people from your own embassy, this doesn't look like victory. Here are U.S. Marines recapturing the old imperial capital of Hue in the northern part of South Vietnam, where they literally had to destroy the city of over 1 million people, brick by brick, to defeat Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces. Now, the United States and South Vietnam technically won, but to the people back in the United States, this doesn't look like victory. This looks like the Viet Cong's much stronger than what the United States has said. It looks like they're much stronger than what LBJ has said. Was our government lying? It's no coincidence that this feeling that maybe the government was lying about the victory in Vietnam, it's no coincidence at the same time there'll be this growing movement that maybe the United States was lying about the assassination of President Kennedy and maybe other things. And that's actually, August has a very good point. Really good point. And I was actually going to come to that. Remember Trenton and Princeton? Trenton and Princeton back in 1776, 1777. The United States, the brand new U.S., had been defeated. Washington's Continental Army was destroyed. But they had counterattacked and won 2 small victories at Trenton and Princeton. And the point was, they didn't win the war with those 2 little victories, but they proved they stayed in the fight and they could survive. Guerrilla wars win by proving they're staying in the fight and surviving. Yes, they're actually a huge comparison. And you can see the similar thing with happen in Iraq at a place called Fallujah against the United States. It's happened a couple times against the U.S. It's amazing how history tends to repeat itself. And then a scene like this appeared on NBC News. Now this is a still from an NBC cameraman. This is back when they had to film by 16 millimeter film and fly back, have it developed. So videotape was brand new. Well, it was around, but portable videotape recorders were brand new. And this was shown on national television, and an AP photographer put this out at the same time, won the Pulitzer Prize for this. Here is the police chief of South Vietnam summarily executing a suspected Viet Cong guerrilla. You notice he's dressed in civilian clothes. And you notice I said the word suspected. There was no trial. They just found this man near where this fighting was, and it's one of the most awful things I've ever seen. He just walks up, kind of laughing with other guys, and this guy standing there, turns and boom, shoots him in the head. Executes him right on TV. This kind of chaotic response and executing people in the street does not look like victory. And that's the point. There's a famous statement by an American major of the 101st Airborne Division that was capturing areas around Ton Son Hood Airfield, which is at the airfield right outside of Saigon. And they basically had to go through building through a little village near the airfield. And was asked about it, and his comment was, we had to destroy the village to save it. Now, he was under stress, made a statement that makes no sense, but think about it. And the Army turned around and said, and so did President Johnson, we won though, we won, we beat back the offensive. And then the Army turned around and said, all we need is 200,000 more men, we'll win the war. 200,000, we can win. Wait a second. You were saying there's light at the end of the tunnel. And then you said, we've won the war. We've won the battle. How can you say we won and then turn around and ask for more troops? I think you see the problem right away. People begin to distrust us, and Lyndon Johnson would not do it. Johnson, I mean, this was a punch in the gut. At the same time, his Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, told Johnson, we should try to get peace. We're not winning. After 3 years of McNamara saying, we're doing the right policy. Johnson was shattered by this, and the impact would be huge. So I want to be very clear about it. It was on the ground, in the battlefield, a tactical U.S. South Vietnam victory, but strategic, long-term, a massive Viet Cong and North Vietnamese victory. They won the long-term battle. And by the way, the credibility gap, people begin to distrust Johnson and the government, which is something that would help fuel a conservative backlash that exists today. And the people lost faith. Overnight, the people begin to lose faith in the war. And the term, the credibility gap, came that people could not trust the word of the government. And by the way, conservatives who oppose government actions like regulation or Social Security, conservative Republicans would use this to their advantage so cleverly. It's actually, even if you disagree with conservative policy, you have to be in awe of how well they've used this to this day. And you remember I told you poll numbers had the people for the war, before the Tet Offensive. A month after it, it totally flipped. And people became against the war. And once they became against the war, this is just at the time that the Democratic nomination, or the Democratic Party was, well, I'm sorry, not the Democratic Party, both parties were beginning the campaign for the election of 1968. And the assumption was LBJ would get the Democratic nomination. I mean, LBJ won the biggest popular vote victory in history. But that's Southern strategy. Gene McCarthy from Minnesota, actually a pretty nondescript senator, he would run as an anti-war candidate. And I'm blocking this, my mug, but it's peace. That button would say peace. Let me move me back here. New Hampshire always has the first primary. Remember, primaries are where parties pick their nominees. This was a progressive reform. But this is still at a time where the convention, in fact, this is the last election where the conventions in reality still chose the candidates, representatives there. The primaries were only, were a small part of it, and this was more like a beauty contest. Who could do well there to use that momentum to get to the primary? JFK would win this primary in '68, and that would give him momentum in the convention to win that convention. Nobody thought McCarthy would win. The primary didn't matter all that much in reality. It was just a beauty contest. So LBJ actually's name wasn't on there, on the ballot, but they assumed that he would win by all the Democrats writing him in. So there was a Republican and Democratic primary at the same time, and this is a month after Tet. And nobody thought McCarthy would win, and he didn't. But he came within just a few percentage points of LBJ. Lyndon Johnson just barely won. And this showed that the people had turned. The Democratic Party, for the most part, was completely with Johnson on the Great Society and civil rights. But Vietnam blew it up. And there was an undercurrent in the South. And so this shook Johnson to its core. And Johnson realized, I might lose. And so Johnson did something that, and then taking advantage of this, John Kennedy's brother, the former Attorney General, and now Senator from New York, Robert Kennedy, jumped into the race. And Kennedy, who was for the war, came out against the war and began to use a saying that nobody really understands. What does this even mean? But it sounded good. Peace with honor. Peace with honor. And Kennedy, who was kind of a hatchet man before his brother's assassination, became a much more thoughtful politician and very much for civil rights. He would split the anti-war vote with McCarthy. A lot of McCarthy supporters were like, hey, you're not the real deal. You're a political opportunist, which he kind of was. But Kennedy had this magnetism, partially because of the love of his brother, but he had something. And it's indescribable. Look at all these people just swarming him to shake his hand. And this great cover of Time magazine. The speeches he gave were magnetic. He really went through a series of changes. I don't know what to think of him, because he really was kind of an ornery hatchet man. Just this pretty tricky politician, and would turn into something else. But the anti-war vote was split. And this shows, I love this picture. This is one of my favorite political pictures. Look at the people meeting him, and you'll notice something else too. He had appeal of a cross-section of society, whites and blacks, even though to a lot of people, and this would be an issue in this very racially charged times, he became the black candidate. And that, would be used against civil rights. And here's Kennedy giving his speech in California. You'll notice his bodyguards, including that's Rosie Greer, who was a defensive tackle for the Los Angeles Rams. There's no Secret Service protection for political candidate or for presidential candidates yet. And so he had this very hodgepodge crew of people guarding him, which, when you think about, wait a second, his brother was assassinated. But that's what we call foreshadowing. And Lyndon Johnson, seeing this, decided, I'm going to have to drop out. And the most amazing thing happened. This is a still of the speech he gave. He went on national television, and he changed the tone of everything. He'd always talked about the war in Vietnam. He turned around and said, I want to talk about peace in Vietnam. And gave this speech of how the United States is going to begin a bombing halt and begin to look for some kind of peace conference, which would become the Paris Peace Accords. And I can't emphasize enough what a big deal that alone was. Johnson before has been saying, we're winning, and now we're going to have a negotiated peace. And then he surprised everybody, including many members of his staff, where he came out and said, since we're in the middle of this potential peace conference, I can't allow the war to get in the way. And he surprised the world and dropped out of the election. And there's no president in history that has ever passed more laws, had done more, attempted more, tried to do more to help people. You could say it's bad policy or good policy, but he consciously tried to help people than President Lyndon Johnson. And that includes, in many ways, Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt was much more successful in helping people, but Johnson tried and did it and was gutted by his foolish decision to go into Vietnam. Yeah, that's my little bit of personal opinion, but I'm pretty much backed up by the facts. But he would win the biggest popular vote victory in American history, wanting a program to expand rights and economic benefits to all Americans. And in 4 years, he had to drop out. What a time. And what a shift for our country. Remember the Great Compression? The Great Compression, where incomes for the bottom 90%, I know it's so weird to say bottom, and that's the vast majority of the population, was growing faster than those on top, even though everybody's growing fast. And the 60s was the greatest economy in American history. You have no idea how good the economy is. You have never seen anything like it. The best economy in your life would be the worst year. The best economic year of your life would be the worst year of the 1960s. And much of the 1970s was better. So we have had nothing like this. You can see the beginning of the end of the Great Compression right here. The conservative revival is now beginning by forcing Johnson out. And conservative economic policies will totally reverse that by 1981. And since then, the bottom 90%, their wealth has been either stagnant or dropping, while those on top have skyrocketed. So this is a big moment. And then, just a few days afterwards, Martin Luther King, who was in Memphis, Tennessee, to support a garbage workers' strike. You're going to watch me do something real quick. To support a garbage workers' strike, Martin Luther King was in Memphis, Tennessee. And I had to change a couple things, so I took something out. I know you got to watch this exciting moment of me. It's not there. No. To support this strike, when he was there, he was assassinated on April 4th, 1968. And the assassin, you can go, when you go there, it's the Lorraine Hotel. And the reason you stay in the Lorraine Hotel was that's where blacks were allowed to stay. Yes, Jim Crow laws were technically gone, but this is Memphis, Tennessee, a very racially charged city. I was there 10, 12 years ago, and it's still a racially charged city. But there were police all over the Lorraine Hotel. Now you might think, oh, they must be there to guard Martin Luther King. No, they were there just hoping that they could arrest him or his supporters with something. They were all surrounding him. And what happened was there was a sniper across the street from the Lorraine Hotel. So if you look, the direction these men are pointing right here. And they're standing over the body of the slain Martin Luther King just seconds after he was shot. And they're pointing to where the sniper came from, because police, when they heard the sniper shots came running out behind bushes from everywhere. They're on the ground running, sprinting at those men with guns drawn. And here's one of the police officers doing the what? Looking back. And he might have had help, but he almost certainly acted alone. But he was able to escape to Canada, then to Britain, and then was trying to get to Rhodesia to fight for which is now Zimbabwe, for the white supremacist government there. His name was James Earl Ray. And he immediately confessed and then recanted and said it was part of a wide CIA threat. But James Earl Ray assassinated him, a escaped convict, yes, he was a white supremacist. He also thought he was going to get a $100,000 reward because there was a monetary reward in secret, like these right-wing magazines would mention that. He might have had some help, but he almost certainly acted alone. But he would later turn around and say that it was part of a conspiracy. And you can understand why a lot of people today believe that the FBI was behind this, including members of King's own family to this day. And the reason why is that from the very moment Martin Luther King came out in the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955, the very moment he came out publicly, the FBI had been harassing him, wiretapping him, threatening him, trying to get him arrested. In 1963, they even sent a letter to Martin Luther King that was from the FBI, basically saying, we know about you, we know what you've done, we know you've had extramarital affairs, and if you don't recant, we'll release this. So you only have one choice, to commit suicide. They tried to get him to commit suicide. The FBI did, the US FBI. And so this was a man who had been harassed his whole life, and that's why a lot of people to this day believe this. Now think about it though for a second. Kennedy, now King. And the conservative backlash was huge. And this is actually pretty shocking. There's a belief today that a lot of people, including people who are so-called conservatives, say, well, we like Martin Luther King, we agree with what he said. Well, he was shockingly unpopular, especially amongst white people. And look at this favorable rating. In 63 and 64, it's around 40%, 45. His favorable rating in 66, just a couple years before he was assassinated, was 33%. His unfavorable, 63%. Many white Americans were opposed to this, thought they were asking for too much, and most of them would see the beginnings of this conservative backlash. And it's fascinating to me to see people talk about Martin Luther King almost like a cartoon figure, where here is this very complex man who fought desperately for equal rights. And his number one fight was not to get rid of Jim Crow laws. It was for economic freedom. He wanted a poor person's march, much like the March on Washington in 63, marches proposed back during World War II by A. Philip Randolph. He wanted a march that summer of 68 to demand an end to poverty because the Vietnam War was gutting the war on poverty. Yes, poverty had shrunk by 50%, but not enough. And then, just 2 months later, Robert Kennedy was assassinated. Now, Robert Kennedy had just won the California Democratic primary. In fact, you see that picture on the when you're looking at the screen on your left. He is a still shot from a film or video. Yes, it is video of him saying, "We just won in California. Now on to the convention." Now he still might not have won the convention, but he won a hard-fought battle, just barely beating Eugene McCarthy. And it looked like he might have had a shot to get that nomination. Now, Lyndon Johnson still controlled the Democratic Party, but it looked like Kennedy might get it. And so this was on national TV. And so it's a little bit after midnight California time. And when he's walking off the stage, saying, off to the convention, in the hallway, they're going to get him through the hallway, through the kitchen, out the back door to get him out of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. He is assassinated on national television. Now, they just show the crowd, and then there's some reaction, and you don't really see the whole assassination, but you hear it. And here he is dying on the floor. Here's here's a kitchen, one workers in the kitchen holding the bodies, one of the first people there, and he was assassinated. And there were a lot of witnesses. They immediately grabbed the person who assassinated him. His name was Sirhan Sirhan. So I guess if the assassin's not going to have three names like James Earl Ray or John Wilkes Booth or Lee Harvey Oswald, it would just have two of the same. Sirhan Sirhan. And he was an American citizen but an immigrant from Palestine. And he was very angry at Robert Kennedy's pro-Israel policy. The United States was becoming in the 1960s very pro-Israel. It wasn't until the 1960s. And he assassinated him. And there are a lot of witnesses. He did it even though there's all these conspiracy theories, because it does seem awful weird, especially with his brother being assassinated. But think about it now. Both Kennedys, Martin Luther King, protests in the streets. It just seems like the whole thing is falling apart. And the funeral train that would take Kennedy home from Los Angeles to where he would be buried in Washington, D.C., and he's buried next to his brother at Arlington National Cemetery in a spot where you can look right down the mall to the Capitol. It's one of the most beautiful spots I've seen. It's pretty amazing. But this was a moment, you combine this with Martin Luther King's assassination. Remember what I told you? Bobby Kennedy was seen by many as the pro-civil rights candidate more than anybody else. This was an absolute crushing moment where it just, the hopelessness will come out of this, and the desperation for somebody to make this feeling go away would start. But thousands of people came out to meet the train carrying the body. There was no really set piece mourning process. It just happened. And these are pictures taken, there's a whole bunch of them, from the train as it went through. And you see people coming out to meet the train. Just arbitrary. Some of these shots really just get me. Just all kinds of regular people who saw Bobby Kennedy as something more than just a candidate for president. And this makes me think he very well could have won the nomination and become president, and would have one of the great what-ifs in history. But 68 then would be just a horrific year. You have these so-called race riots. You have student protests. Columbia University was taken over by students demanding an end to the war and civil rights and more rights for students and professors. Drug use, illegal drug use seemed to go up, and the old joke was, you always think about, there's always a joke about people in the 1960s taking a lot of drugs. Now, people actually would do a lot more drugs in the 80s, 90s, and through today. But it just seemed like, because it was all brand new, the anti-war movement was growing. And it just seemed like the whole thing was falling apart. There were huge student protests in Paris. In fact, Paris went to almost armed conflict. It happened in Mexico City, where Mexican police would shoot and kill in the center of Mexico City at least 10,000 people. Much of this was covered up. It seemed like the whole world was falling apart. And into the breach stepped Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon would come back after being humiliated in 1960, and humiliated again when he tried to be governor in 62. He would come rolling in as the new, I guess really the new Nixon. And he, this political opportunist, but more than that, he understood the resentment and anger of people who felt like the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, the growing women's rights movement, which I'll talk about on Monday. He understood their resentment. He came in, and this actually the kind of socially awkward guy came in as the man who he sold himself as someone who could bring the country together. And he said, I have a secret plan to get out of Vietnam. Now, I'm going to be very clear about it. My secret plan is, I can't tell you, it's secret, but I have a secret plan. His secret plan was to never leave, but that's another story. But he said he'd get out of the war. And to people in 1968, it's just, thank you, we'll get out of the war. While the Democrats are bitterly divided over this, the Republicans are saying we'll get out of the war, even though the people who want the war are supporters of Nixon. They should tell you that it was never really true. And he would begin the Southern strategy. And that's where you get the great Dixieland is Nixonland. Remember, there was no Republican Party in the South, but it started in 64. And the two slogans would be law and order and peace with honor. Now, peace with honor, this idea that we could somehow win the Vietnam War and step out. But the law and order one was really crucial. What's the law and order? Everybody knew what that meant. It's code. Just like it was code that states' rights was anti-civil rights. Law and order was he's going to crack down on the blacks who are protesting in the cities. He's going to crack down. He's going to stop this. Everybody knew law and order meant racism. We're going to crack down. If that's what it was. Law and order, crack down. We're going to crack down on those people protesting in the streets. That's what it meant. It's states' rights. And this was all coded. All words in the South. Of course, in the South, it wasn't quite as known. But he's going to break away Democrats who might support the economic programs of the Democrats, but break them away on issues like culture. We are going to stop that civil rights movement. They're asking too much. They're out of control. And then the Democrats would give them ammunition in 1968 in their convention. This convention, the Democratic Convention, you can imagine how it is in total disarray. They are split between the anti-war people and people who feel they must support the war because of Lyndon Johnson. Even though he's not running, Lyndon Johnson's vice president, Hubert Humphrey, is going to get the nomination. I'll come back to that, so don't worry, we'll come back to that. It's split. And anti-war protesters put out this call for thousands of anti-war protesters to protest the Democratic Convention in Chicago. Now, only about 10,000 came out. Only, that's a lot. But Chicago would bring in hire police forces from all over the country, National Guard and U.S. Army troops, and they would have over 50,000 police and Army troops to stop 10,000 protesters. And here are protesters where they would nominate a pig as president, Pigosaurus they called it, haha, good joke, whatever. But a number of events happened where the police would wade into the protesters and brutally attack them. And looking back at this, a congressional hearing would eventually a congressional study would eventually label this a police riot, where the police attacked the protesters brutally. And part of the reason were that the police were furious with the protesters. And before we get to, and I should add, before we get to COINTEL, part of the reason the police were protesting, or so angry at the protesters, was the same reason that Richard Nixon played on this resentment. The police were looking at, a lot of the police, and they saw these protesters as rich, spoiled kids who could get out of the draft because they had enough money to go to college, they could have political connections, the draft was unfair. Where working class people like police officers and their kids, it's their kids who are going to war. It is people like them, their brothers, who are going to go fight in Vietnam, while these rich, spoiled protesters who are all college students are fighting against the war. Now, this is a generalization, but that's what a lot of them thought. So when they saw them nominating a pig, they were just furious. And then at Haymarket Park, the same one with the Haymarket Fair back in 1887, somebody climbed on top of the statue of the police officers there and raised a Viet Cong flag. And they were just seething with anger. So the very night that they're debating the anti-war plank to the Democratic Convention, which failed, Democratic platform, police waded into the crowd. But what is COINTEL? COINTEL means counterintelligence. And what I mean by that is, there were FBI and police agents within the protesters, not just gathering information. They were agent provocateurs. And what they were doing is, they were trying to carry out outrageous acts to give a justification to crack down on them. This should remind you a little bit of civil disobedience. This would happen as old as you could get, as old as there had been secret polices. They infiltrate and then try to give an excuse for them to attack. The guy who raised the Viet Cong flag on that statue was an FBI agent. Yes, that's how many they had. There's debate on how many COINTEL, counterintelligence agents, there were within the crowd. I've seen as high as a third. That seems ridiculous, but it very well could have been. And this is rather interesting. They just found that somebody who was trying to be a provocateur in Minneapolis just yesterday turned out to be a member of the Minneapolis Police Department. But let's watch a little bit of these protests. Here's the police, and many of them had taken their badges off. They took their badges off because that's where their ID number was, so they couldn't be identified. And they waded the crowds with their day sticks and nightsticks and beat the hell out of the protesters.
It's really a bad place to be in.
They're chanting, "The whole world's watching." And this is being shown on national television just as the Democrats are meeting right next door to in the convention center. This looks like the Democrats are in total disarray. tear gas. Well, Hubert Humphrey, Lyndon Johnson's vice president, would get the nomination. But his party was blown apart. Nobody thought Humphrey would win after this. Nobody thought this. And my battery is running low. I forgot to plug in my computer. So, nobody thought Humphrey would win. Labor unions were bitterly divided. For the most part, labor unions were all with Hubert Humphrey. But the anti-war protests, especially the fact that a lot of the union members' kids are the ones fighting the war, they felt that they were being, or the party was leaving them behind. And so the slogan, wherever Humphrey would go, nobody gave him campaign money, and the slogan of dump the hump would follow him. By the way, HHH, his name was Hubert Horatio Humphrey. And so you have, FDR, JFK, LBJ, and then H cubed. Ha-ha! And so dump the hump wherever he would go. Humphrey would finally break away from the president a few weeks before the election and come out for peace in Vietnam, and all of a sudden, everything turned. And it looked like he had a legitimate chance to win, but it was too late. Humphrey came out too late for peace. And so many people who naturally should have been supporting Humphrey, who was always opposed to the war, but he felt his hands were tied because of because of Lyndon Johnson. And then the Democrats split again over civil rights. And even though the Nixon administration was kind of mad because it hurt their Southern strategy, it actually hurt Humphrey probably more. George Wallace, the segregationist governor of Alabama, he unified with Curtis LeMay, the guy who wanted to blow up Cuba and did the firebombing of Japan, to form the American Independent Party. But everybody called them the Dixiecrats or the States' Rights Party. And this was, and by the way, LeMay's reputation would be destroyed by this. He was actually a New Deal Democrat who just was rabidly anti-communist. And Wallace promised to not only end civil rights, but also he wanted to turn North Vietnam into, and this is, I quote, a glowing parking lot. And the States' Rights Party was law and order, anti-civil rights, crack down on those drug addicts and hippies, and win the war. But by seeing the flag behind them, and also the campaign button for there were term limits in Alabama, so his wife would become governor, I think you know what direction he's going. The Confederate battle flag, as everybody knew by then, was a symbol of anti-equal rights. George Wallace. And Wallace came in, and this took away the Southern vote from Humphrey. Now, it also took away Southern votes from Nixon. And without a doubt, this hurt Nixon in some places. But it hurt Humphrey more. The Democratic Party was split. And then, last thing for today. This is sometimes called the October surprise. Lyndon Johnson came out just as Humphrey is starting to do better. And by the way, Humphrey's doing better. He was actually taking away votes probably from Wallace. Humphrey is doing better. He might win. And then Lyndon Johnson announced, we're beginning Paris peace talks, and we might have what everybody would soon dub a Paris peace agreement. There might be peace. And this would only help the Democrat and only help Humphrey. Nixon totally freaked out. Nixon ran a non-campaign. He ran the campaign basically sit back and let the Democrats implode. But going in October, oh no, he might lose. By the way, this is very much the kind of campaign that Joe Biden appears to be trying to run against Donald Trump. Play on Donald Trump's unpopularity. And it looked like for Nixon, it might have pulled up. But remember, Nixon had the reputation of tricky dick. And this is what he would come with. Nixon conspired to blow the Paris peace talks up before the election. President 2, right there on the right, was the dictator, former general, head of South Vietnam. He took over in 1967 and would be the president of South Vietnam till the end of South Vietnam in 1975. So this dictator won. And Nixon, through a secret back channel, a bunch of different people, went to 2 and said, drop out of the peace talks. If South Vietnam drops out, the peace talks will fall apart. drop out, and Nixon promised him, all in secret, I pledge to you, the United States will never go away. We will help you win the war. I pledge to you. So Nixon was lying about that plan to end the war and secretly conspired with President to bail out of the peace conference, and just days before the election, the peace talks ended. The FBI was actually illegally bugging Nixon's campaign. I know. It's unbelievable stuff that was going on. And they told LBJ. LBJ was furious. And he went to Humphrey and said, you got to say something, because they couldn't say anything about the illegal peace talks. But Humphrey was really disturbed about these illegal wiretaps and refused to use it. I don't know if he should have or shouldn't, but it didn't matter. The election would turn out to be one of the closest elections in American history. Nixon would barely win the popular vote, win the electoral vote, and it looks like a lot, but a couple of these states were razor thin. Illinois, Ohio, New Jersey, just razor thin margins. And Nixon would be elected president just barely. And look at the Deep South, right here. They went to Wallace, but look at the rest of the South, the Southern strategy. Texas, that's LBJ state. But from then on, it's going to be Republican stronghold. And I should add, right here, Nixon won. If the Paris peace talks would not have been scuttled, or Humphrey would have came out against the war just a week earlier, Hubert Humphrey would have been elected president. And Hubert Humphrey was a tireless fighter for civil rights and was he's an old New Dealer and therefore Great Society guy. Nixon was the exact opposite. Nixon was conservative. Who knows how things would have been different? Let me say one thing. The war would have ended in 6 months. Nixon pledged to get out of the war and then scuttled a talk to get out, peace talks to get out of the war. And the war is going to last with the Americans in it for over 4 years. And the war would not officially end until 1975. Over 2 million people are going to die in those 7 years. And when the United States finally pulled out, the agreement they made was very similar to the agreement that was the first agreement on the table that October of 1968. Very similar. In the time that Nixon scuttled the peace talks to the Americans left, over 23,000 Americans would die. Richard Nixon is responsible for their deaths. And the war went on for years after years, and over 1 million South Vietnamese in just those 4 years. 2 million total. And so that tells you what type of guy Richard Nixon is. Now, I can't help my political point of view on some things, but there's one president that I will say that I hate. I hate everything about him. It's Richard Nixon. And this is a transformative moment. 68 is that moment. The Democratic Party's imploding and didn't know how to handle it, and Nixon style of politics would become the politics of today. Divide, divide, divide. Despite his pledge for a reunified nation, there was no president more divisive. And that's, let me rephrase that. There's no president who used divisions more effectively than Richard Nixon. And now we are just so divided by this. On that happy note, I'll quit. So 68, let's say it's a big year. Now, quiz will go up right after this. I'll put the quiz up, and then, so just a couple more days next week, and then we're done. Please get the test. The quiz is a quiz from last week. I am grading these. I'll put up both assignments today. That's the last assignment you're ever going to get from me. If there's no more questions, I am done. Everyone, have a good weekend. It looks like it's going to be a beautiful weekend. All the sun